the momentous decision handed down by the Supreme Court on May 17, 1954.
Hello, my name is Edward Clifton, and I'm an Associate Justice here in the State Superior Court of the state of Rhode Island. And for the next few moments, myself and other individuals would like to take you through the history leading up to the famous United States Supreme Court decision of Brown versus Board of Education. The story of Linda Brown leading up to Brown versus Board of Education started many years before the decision was handed down 50 years ago today, on May 17, 1954. For many years before Brown was decided, there was a law that existed in the United States under which schools were treated as being separate but equal. Children who were black children were treated as being different than children who were white children. They could not be educated in the same schools, in the same classrooms. And as a result of many courageous individuals, including Thurgood Marshal, who was a lawyer who practiced in the NAACP Legal Defense Fund under the leadership of Charles Hamilton Houston, they challenged the laws as they existed. I am the past president of the Thurgood Marshal Law Society here in the state of Rhode Island. And you will hear today from a number of individuals, one of whom who was a direct beneficiary, like myself, of the Brown versus Board of Education decision. More than 50 years ago, the challenges to separate but equal education began. They began primarily through litigation brought against the school districts, primarily in the South. On May 17, 1954, the United States Supreme Court, consisting of 9 justices, led by then Chief Justice Earl Warren, pronounced that separate but equal could no longer be tolerated as they existed in the public schools. Since that time, there have been many changes that have been made in the ability of people to become educated. Many people have stated that the decision of Brown versus Board of Education opened the door to what is known as the Civil Rights Movement, which occurred primarily in the late 1950s and throughout the 1960s. A number of people still today question whether or not the effects of Brown versus Board of Education have made a lasting change in the quality of education in the United States. It is through the efforts of these notable individuals who you will be hearing more about today that led to the doors being opened and the quality of education being made equal. Not long ago, just last week to be precise, or a little bit over a week ago, the late Justice Marshal's widow, Cecilia Marshall, came to Rhode Island and addressed a symposium of judges, deans of law schools, lawyers, and again remembered for all of us who are alive today about the contributions that were made by these courageous group of individuals, not only just the lawyers who participated in representing the individuals, but also the individuals themselves. People like Oliver Brown, the father of Linda Brown, people like Linda Brown herself, people not only in the state of Kansas, where Brown versus Board of Education was initially brought, but people who resided in South Carolina, people who resided in the state of Virginia, people who resided in the state of Delaware, people who resided in the District of Columbia, our nation's capital. It is through the efforts, through the integrity, through the persuasiveness of these individuals that institutions as we now know them exist today. You'll be hearing later from a young lady, Allison Rodriguez, who was a student at Bain Middle School in the city of Cranston. And I want to take this opportunity to thank the Cranston School Department, and particularly the Bain Middle School, for their assistance in making this video available to all of you today. You'll also be hearing from Shelia Hai King, who is an attorney here in the state of Rhode Island, who will give you her vivid memories of what it was, her reaction and her family's reaction to the decision of Brown versus Board of Education after it was handed down on May 17, 1954. And we encourage all of you to learn more about the history leading up to Brown versus Board of Education. We encourage you to ask your teachers about the impact of Brown versus Board of Education. We encourage you to search through your libraries, both at your schools and in your local communities, to learn more about the impact of this tremendous decision. And we encourage you to every day, for the rest of your lives, to show the example of how wonderful and how beautiful life can be when people understand that they must treat each other fairly and equitably throughout their lives. And thank you very much.
The Brown versus Board of Education decision is probably the most important decision issued by the Supreme Court during the 20th century. This is so because it influenced the civil rights movement, the women's movement, employment law. It also affected a rising consciousness in the world about issues of caste, class, and poverty. Many years ago, there was no such thing as civil rights law. The first civil rights law course was taught at Howard University in the 30s under the leadership of Charles Hamilton Houston. Today, we take civil rights law for granted.
Chief Justice Earl Warren, speaking for a unanimous court, overruled the doctrine of separate but equal, which had long kept the Negro a second-class citizen.
I remember on May 17, 1954, when the Brown versus Board of Education decision was issued. I was attending a segregated school in Washington, D.C. On that day, my principal called an assembly of the students in the halls of the school. Now, our assembly was held in the halls because we were attending a school that did not have an auditorium, unlike the white schools in Washington, D.C. We assembled in the halls, and the upper grade students stood on the steps, and the principal announced that the United States Supreme Court had just handed down a decision in Brown versus the Board of Education, declaring that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. She explained that many of us would be going to new schools the next year. In September, I attended an integrated school in Washington, D.C. My own personal experience in the District of Columbia Public Schools showed the problem that the Brown decision posed for the white community. I remember my first day at school after Brown versus Board of Education, attending when I was in the integrated school. It was Woodridge Elementary School in Washington, D.C. My teacher asked the girls to line up. She said, I'd like for, and I thought she said, all the nice girls to line up. And I got in line, and I looked at the line, and all of the girls in the line were white, and two black girls were still sitting at their seats, and the whole class was laughing. Well, I said, why don't you come up? Come up. She wants all of the nice girls to get in line. And my teacher said, can't you understand English? And I said, yes. And she said, well, why are you in line? I said, well, I'm a nice girl. She said, "I said white girls." Well, I was really embarrassed because the children must have thought that I was white. I thought she had said nice. I'd never had a teacher tell me to line up on the basis of race before. Well, she had all the white girls to line up, and then she had all of the white boys to line up. Then she asked the black girls to line up and the black boys. And then she said, "This is the way you will get in line every day that you're in my classroom." She said, "No white child will ever drink from a water fountain after a black child. And no white child will use the restrooms after a black child." This was in September of 1954. I was living in Washington, D.C. at that time. And if you went to Union Station, the train terminal, you would go in and there would be a sign for whites only, and then there was a sign for Negroes, because that's what blacks or African Americans were called at the time. You would have water fountains for whites and water fountains for Negroes. If you went to the 5 and 10 and sat down at a lunch counter, you would be invited to leave. That happened to me on 3 occasions. My mother took us to the Kresge 5 and 10. We sat down to order our lunch, and the waitress refused to serve us. She said, "If you'd like to have lunch, you can go to the end of the lunch counter, but you won't sit here and eat." So you can see that the Brown decision was very important, but there was massive white resistance to that decision. Initially, many of the southern schools closed. The Prince William, Virginia County School closed their public schools, and the white students went to private academies, and the black students went to the tobacco fields. Many of those black students never returned to school, and that's very sad. At the time of Brown, James Nabritt, a constitutional scholar and law professor at Howard University, remembered that his students were ecstatic. They, like many people in the black community, believed that Brown would be the solution to all of the problems of race, but that was not the case. The integration of Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957 was followed by violence, and federal troops had to be ordered in by the President of the United States. The Supreme Court had said, with all deliberate speed, to many in the South, all deliberate speed meant never. It wasn't until the 1960s that many in the schools in the South were actually integrated. Now in many urban areas, we have schools that are all black or all Hispanic, and people say that Brown is a failure. But Brown's decision is not a failure, I assure you. I'm standing here today to tell you that. The work of Brown is more than the work of the Supreme Court, and it takes more than the goodwill of the Supreme Court. The work of Brown requires the goodwill of all aspects of the community: families, churches, synagogues, mosques, businesses, media, educational institutions, legislatures, and the executive branch, all committed to fairness and justice. I want each of you to remember that the Rhode Island courts are our courts. Our courts belong to us. As an attorney, I'm an officer of the court, and I invite you to come and visit the courts of Rhode Island.
In Brown versus the Board of Education, the United States Supreme Court changed American society with its historical ruling after 13 families in Topeka, Kansas filed a lawsuit against the Topeka Board of Education because they felt segregation violated the 14th Amendment. They filed the lawsuit because African American children had to travel many miles past the schools in their neighborhood to attend an African American school, while white children attended white schools with more and better book supplies. They wanted to prove that the slogan "separate but equal" from Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 was not fair or true. Thurgood Marshal was a man who always wanted to help the African American community. He went to law school at Howard University, which was the first all-African American college. There, Marshall had a professor, Charles Hamilton Houston, who gave Marshall and all his other students advice. Dr. Houston advised them to be great lawyers, not good lawyers, because anyone could be a good lawyer, but you have to be great. He encouraged them to work for social change. After law school, Marshall was a lawyer for the NAACP, which stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Thurgood Marshal was the lawyer that was assigned to this memorable case that affected everyone in this country. Marshall was very thrilled about being assigned to this case, because while he was a young boy, he also faced racism, and he wanted it to stop. Many lawyers at Howard University and other lawyers who were very concerned for the equality assisted Thurgood Marshal on this case. Marshall and the others worked very hard on this case. The first point that Marshall made was that segregation violated the 14th Amendment, as all person born or naturalized in the United States has equal protection of the law. Another point Marshall made was that segregation made the education unequal for black children. Dr. Kenneth Clark, who studied in psychology, testified about this. Dr. Clark said that black children in segregated schools felt inferior to white children, and as a result of these feelings, they performed poorly in the academic area. Also, Marshall argued that segregation in school and in other places violated the Constitution and that segregation had to end. Another point Marshall made was that allowing segregation to continue in this country would hurt the United States' relationship with other countries, because immigrants would fear that the people in America would treat them with disrespect. After considering the premises that Thurgood Marshal argued in Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, the judges in the Supreme Court made the decision that segregation in schools indeed violated the 14th Amendment and segregation had to end. In my opinion, it was very important to end segregation. First of all, today many whites and blacks are sharing their different cultures with one another, and today most whites see and think differently from those in the past about African Americans. Now, African Americans are finally being treated with respect, and immigrants can share in the freedom that we have in this country. For all of these reasons, I am happy that segregation ended. I want to follow in Thurgood Marshal's footsteps. Years after Brown versus Board of Education, Thurgood Marshal was appointed to the United States Supreme Court. He and the many people and organizations that worked with him on the Brown case have made it possible for me to know that one day I, Allison Michaela Rodriguez, can become a lawyer and maybe even become a judge on the United States Supreme Court.
Hi, I'm Mike Fontaine, President of the Thurgood Marshal Law Society. And this is Allison Rodriguez, an 8th grade student at the Hugh B. Bain Middle School.
To learn more about the Brown versus the Board of Education decision and the important historical figures discussed in this presentation, please visit your local library.